My dad used to be a very good driver. Ever since he learned how to drive at the age of 14, it was always his passion. He would always tell me stories of how he used to grab Granddad's car and he always took his friends for a ride in the middle of the night. When my dad finished high school in the 1970s, there were not many work options in the town. Luckily, one of the options he had was to become a truck driver. And at the age of 18, my dad actually became a truck driver. And eventually he got married to his first wife and had his first child in 1978. And for many years he kept working as a truck driver for the same company. In 1986, he divorced his wife. 2 years later, he met my mom and married her. And the year after, I was born. I'm named after my dad, Aiden. Growing up, I was very close to him. We used to spend lots of time together, even though he did have complicated schedules. And sometimes he had to be gone for 2, 3, 4 days straight because he had to drive his truck to other towns, and he often had to spend the night on the road, either in his truck or in a motel. But then he'd be back for the rest of the week. And I was my dad's only son. His other child was my half-sister, but she would only visit us sometimes during the holidays and during Christmas. And despite Dad's job, I actually used to spend more time with him than my mom. She worked as a waitress in a diner and normally had to work night shifts from 7 p.m. until early in the morning the next day. So my time with my mom was really limited. When both my parents were gone, my grandma Lucy used to look after me. Dad kept working as a truck driver pretty much my whole childhood. But when I started high school, he unfortunately lost his job. The company where he always worked went bankrupt and had no choice but to sell. And the new owners, a nationwide company, they decided to get rid of the staff and only worked with their own people. So, as you could imagine, this was very difficult for my father. He was a hard-working man, and his father always taught him to provide for his family first. Dad had worked ever since he was 18, and staying home without anything to do wasn't an option. He tried to find another job, but it was kind of difficult. You see, the economic situation of our little town was near non-existent, and there weren't many jobs at the time. Unless you moved to one of the bigger towns, which was an idea Dad considered, but his mind soon changed because Mom didn't want to go and leave Grandma Lucy, who was old and sick, behind. Dad was unemployed for almost a year until one of his old high school friends recommended him a job. His friend Malcolm was a train engineer who had connections within the Midwest. And Malcolm had told my father that there were positions available. And funny enough, my father had actually engineered a train for a very brief period of time, and his father was a train engineer as well. My granddad, that is. And Dad went to meet the people who were hiring, and, well, he immediately got the job. My dad was ecstatic. But after a couple of weeks of induction, he started to work taking cargo from one place to another, and I remember how happy he used to be with his fancy-looking uniform. And since he was new, he only piloted the trains here in Wisconsin. Years later, I finished school and decided to move to the big city. I still managed to speak to my parents often, though. Soon after I left, they gave him the option to do another route with the train that involved going to 2 other states. He had to depart from here in Wisconsin, then pass through Iowa until he got to Nebraska. Not a difficult route. In the scheme of things, it was actually pretty straightforward. Though Dad hadn't done that route so much as he normally did travels to New York, Georgia, and Florida when he was a truck driver. When he told me about it, he had already been doing that route for a month or so, and I remember him telling me something along these lines. The The route's amazing. The route is amazing, and I don't know what that drunken idiot meant. And I had no idea what he was talking about, so I asked him, and he told me that, surprisingly. Even though it was one of the shortest out-of-state routes, many people don't like it. He said that one guy he met at the local bar even told him that route was the worst decision he could take. My dad just laughed it off and paid no attention. Being a train engineer can be more competitive than you can imagine, so he thought this guy was just saying bullshit. I remember researching for information, though at the time the internet was not as great as it is now, and I came across the website. It was just a regular page, and the website was basically people complaining about driving into the Midwest. Due to the poor internet connection, I couldn't read further into it, and well, to be honest, I even forgot about that website the same day, and well, I didn't think about it until years later. 6 months passed ever since I left, and since Dad started doing his new route, when I went back to visit my parents for Christmas. And Dad and I haven't been in contact too often lately because we were both very busy. And it definitely took me by surprise to see him. I don't think I ever saw him looking so skinny before. And Dad was never fat, but he always had a beer belly and big cheeks, but I don't know, they just were no longer there. He almost looked gaunt. And I asked him if he was on a diet, and I patted his stomach. He would normally have laughed it off and simply answered the question like the happy extroverted man that he was. But instead he timidly smiled. Throughout the evening, Dad was just not the same. He barely touched the Christmas meal and was very quiet. He also left the house many times to smoke, even though he hadn't smoked ever since he left his first wife. And when we finally had some time together, I asked him what was the matter. He refused to tell me at first, but after a couple of glasses of whiskey, he confessed his worries. He refused to tell me at first, but after a couple of glasses of whiskey, he confessed his worries. He didn't know why anything was happening, but ever since he started to do the new route, he felt exhausted and thought he was seeing strange things. Things that possibly could not exist. The strange thing is that it would normally happen between Iowa and Nebraska, and I asked him whether his exhaustion could be due to overworking, but he immediately cut me off. No, you don't understand. It's like every time I pass through the same area, something drains me. Something watches me from the fields and the forest we pass through. I just feel as though it drains my energy. I feel a random sensation inside of me. I can't even begin to explain it. The worst thing, son. The worst thing is that I hear this buzzing in my skull. Hell, sometimes even piloting the train becomes difficult. I try to forget about it and keep working, but every single time I go through Iowa and Nebraska, it gets worse and worse. I don't know why, but images come through my head. I feel like I'm going insane. I don't know. He said to me. I could tell he was worried. I've never seen Dad like this. And I recommended him to visit a doctor immediately. Perhaps all this was due to exhaustion and lack of sleep. He promised me he would seek professional help. 2 months after visiting my parents during one of our weekly phone conversations, I asked Dad about his problems. He didn't sound much better and even mentioned how the doctor just said he was simply suffering from stress. The doctor gave him some pills that seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Despite all this, Dad refused to take a break. He was such a stubborn man. And I remember his last words from that night. The sound is following me everywhere. Aiden, if you see it, run, move, get away from what it is. You will know what I'm talking about if you see it. And he hung up the phone. The next week, I got a call from my mom. "We can't find him, Aiden. He's gone," said Mom between sobs. And I didn't even ask more questions. I knew what she meant. I don't even remember hanging up the house phone or anything. And the next thing I knew, I was already on my way from Chicago to my parents' house. My heart was racing so fast and I kept feeling sweaty. I remember that particular night the sky looked different while I was on the road. It looked gray. Once I arrived, Mom was with a police officer. I got told what happened. They found Dad's train stopped on the track in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs of any accident happening, and all the cargo was still there, so they don't think it was theft. I was asked some more questions and tried to answer as honestly as I could. After 3 days of agony and much searching, Dad was found, unconscious, in the Neil Woods of Nebraska. He was immediately taken to the hospital where they examined him. He had no signs of trauma. It took me by surprise seeing Dad looking even more haggard than the last time I saw him. Doctors explained he was unconscious due to dehydration, but explained he would be fine. Dad woke up later on that day and he was very upset. As soon as he opened his eyes, I quickly stood up from my seat and got closer, but his reaction was violent. He started kicking and screaming for help. We couldn't control him. Heck, he wouldn't even let us near him. Nurses had no choice but sedating him. The next 2 times he woke up, he was still agitated. It was not until the 3rd time that we could actually speak to him. But my dad, he sounded crazy. He was telling us how he got abducted by something. How something climbed onto the locomotive, grabbed him out of the train, and threw him off. I don't know. The doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia. But we took Dad home after being in the hospital for 2 weeks. He seemed more quiet, but he still kept mentioning this creature. I thought Dad was hallucinating, and we knew that he just ran away, leaving the train behind. Nevertheless, there was an unanswered question. The train was found on the border of Wisconsin and Iowa. So how the hell was he found in Nebraska? And that's a very long distance if you're walking. And why was Dad in the Neil Woods? And due to everything that had happened, I decided to eventually move back to my hometown. Mom couldn't work anymore because she had to look after Dad. Even though they received some benefits, it just wasn't enough. They needed my help. And thanks to Dad, I know a lot about cars and trucks, so I started working as a mechanic. It's sad for me to say, but Dad never got better. 3 years after that incident, Dad committed suicide. It was devastating for our family to see how Dad deteriorated through the years. He left a letter that said, "It was the only way for this to stop." Even though it was difficult, we all accepted the truth. Years later, I started noticing a pattern. Many of the men who worked as train engineers on that route complained about the same thing. A constant buzz in their ears and a paranoia that something was either on the train or out in the wilderness watching them. Now, plenty of them later on in life were diagnosed with a certain type of mental disorder, and I spoke to some of the people who were affected by this. They sounded just like my dad. Some seemed more stable than others, including someone I met at a bar. His name was Mr. Thompson. That's all I'm going to call him by. When I met Mr. Thompson at the bar, I knew exactly who he was. He was the man who told Dad years ago not to start piloting trains on that route. I asked him why, and he immediately told me that deep down I knew why. Mr. Thompson also gave me the name of a website. He insisted me to visit it to find all of my answers. So I decided to investigate online, and to my infinite surprise, I came across the same website I found many years ago. The website had improved and was much more complete. And just like before, many people wrote about their weird experiences driving through the Midwest. Many people complained about hearing a strange buzzing and seeing a strange being out in the distance, or it even staring at the locomotive, just like Dad had said. And some others talked about feeling extremely tired all of a sudden while on that route, and many claimed to see a gray sky all the way through. Reading further into it, I noticed many people spoke these odd encounters with strange, dark creatures with wispy hair and red eyes that moved like lightning. Many people swear they have seen these creatures run onto the locomotive and stare into the windows. And when they do, the buzzing becomes so intense that the engineer would often fall unconscious, usually to be found and woken up by the conductor. Some people claimed they were also abducted and found in the Neil Woods and would never be the same. Most of these people would often end up in psychiatric wards, with the doctors claiming the stress of the job and home life caused the condition. Now I know all these things might sound like a conspiracy theory, just like the lizard people or the crystal children. But I need to find out. And that's why I have decided from now on, I'm going to learn how to become a train engineer. And after all, to learn the truth, you've got to expose yourself.